Hi everyone. My name is Cheryl. I'm also from Singapore, with a team under the Prime Minister's office called the Strategic Policy Office. Okay, so I'm presenting on behalf of Team Polisphere. Okay, so I think one of the things, when we started to talk about our idea, the original idea came from this idea of network city-states. I ended up the presenter because I'm the only one who actually lives in a city-state. But I think, and the idea kind of evolved, right, as we discussed. So I think what I wanted to start my presentation with was this metaphor of a string of pearls, right? So originally when the term string of pearls was coined, it was actually coined in a Department of Defense report on energy futures and the energy security in Asia. And it was the idea of the expansion of Chinese geopolitical influence, because the string of pearls refers to the Chinese sea lines of communication that stretch from the Chinese mainland out to the port of Sudan. So we want to move away from, that kind of the idea of a sovereign nation expanding its influence, but the idea of, okay, if we had a territory, and we've coined this lovely phrase, a territory that's defined by a global network of autonomous metropolitan regions with flows in between. Okay, let that sink in for a bit, a bit of a mouthful. But you think about it as, so I wanted to kind of flag out two elements of that, right? So one element of it is the autonomous metropolitan regions. We resisted very strongly from referring to them as city-states, but that's where the idea originated. You can think of these as our pearls. And if you think about it as the global network with flows in between, and these flows are not necessarily just people flows, they can also be resource flows, finance flows, etc. And you think of that as the string, right? So what kind of unites some of these cities and how they interact with each other. Okay, so the next part we were talking about the political subject, right? Because obviously if you're talking about territory, presumably, you're talking about some sort of either, basic people who live in this territory. We did have a debate about whether or not we would allow trees to vote because our idea had this bioregion element as well. But I think one of the things that we wanted to point out was actually, we're thinking of this idea of, well, there needs to be some consciousness, right? So, at least at the way that we currently understand it. And so we're thinking about these political subjects, whether or not we can have this multifaceted idea of, in this case, we're calling it citizenship, but take the idea of citizenship very loosely. Typically, what you have in a global city, in a major city, the political subject and the population are not the same. Right? So it's this idea of how can we be more expansive in our definition of who gets to participate in this political process. For example, am I able to account for people who are transient? Even if you lived in Singapore for a long time, if you're not a citizen, you don't vote, right? I mean, same as everywhere else in the world. But can we allocate some rights to that person? Can we allocate rights to future residents, for example? And so it's this idea of how can we be more expansive about this definition of political subject. Okay, and of course when we talk about political subject, then we have to come and ask ourselves the questions about what these political subjects are like, right? So this brings us to the human nature part of it. We debated this a little bit. We started out quite optimistic about how we viewed people, and we said, oh, they're going to be altruistic and awesome. That doesn't make for a very fun scenario, because in reality, people are not always altruistic and awesome. But we did decide that we would want them to be social. They were inherently social creatures. They wanted to connect with each other, but this could be to a positive or negative effect, and I think that was quite important, right? So there is maybe perhaps an altruistic element, but that it can also be destructive. These are the kind of people we're dealing with. And the kind of values that they have, and we've split the values into two bits. Because we are dealing with this kind of string of pearls concept, and there's obviously an inherent diversity in that, we wanted to talk about, being cosmopolitan, but we wanted to talk about it as being a process. So what does that mean in terms of, how tensions are accepted, valued, the amount of respect we give to each other, etc. And we wanted to include in this idea of diversity all biological life. So this is where we try to include the trees because they didn't get to vote. So, and this idea that we've encompassed, not only even though the political subjects, may be human in this sense, they also encompass they have a right and responsibility to encompass the views of other biological life. The next part is talking about the values, right? And we wanted to talk a little bit about promoting well-being now and into the future. So we're talking about a very forward-looking type of population. Just to move on quickly. So the cosmology. I love this picture. It's the idea of basically there's this sense that, because the biosphere is changing, it forces the human change, and the idea that it's a very complex system, and the way that it levels up, it's basically a process of chaos-driven evolution, is the term that we coined. The very last bit we're going to talk about is actually the metrics. Because we talked a lot about well-being and what that meant for the future generations, we also wanted to encompass this idea of metrics being data-driven, and encompass and to reflect things like, basically the values that this place would have, including things like the cosmopolitan nature of the Polisphere. So those were the kind of metrics that we were talking about. The other one we talked about a little bit was also the idea of upward mobility, right? Because we had this very forward-looking idea of the future, and if that's the case, then there must be some assumption that you're working towards a future that is better tomorrow than it was today. So this is our preamble, which I'm just going to read out to you. Given that the 21st century challenges cannot be met with the institutions of the past, we, the sentient life of this planet, hereby establish Polisphere in order to form a more perfect network of metropolitan autonomous regions to protect, maintain, and promote collective well-being of all known life forms and future generations thereof. Thank you.